Are you ready to alter your life? Because that's what's about to happen. If you're looking for a judgment-free zone where TMI doesn't exist, to have the conversations you're not supposed to have, and explore how to make small yet substantial, sustainable changes in your life to actually care for and empower yourself through physical and emotional fitness, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Alyssa Alter, MOMDON, the Amy Poehler of vaginas, author, speaker, coach, former Broadway performer, certified Pilates instructor, pelvic health expert, comedian, co-founder of postpartum.com, mom on the mend, and board certified doctor of nothing. I believe that if we put as much time, energy, and discipline on our insides as we do our outsides, we'll be unstoppable. This week's episode really blew my mind. Now, I am often impressed by the people that I invite to be on the show because that's why I invite them on the show. Erin recontextualizes addiction in a way that is so powerful, relatable, and human that she has changed the way that I think about things, the way that I look at the world, and the way that I look at other human beings struggling with the human experience. If you haven't read Erin's memoir, Strung Out, it's not too late. There's a link in the show notes. It is so good. And again, Erin paints the human picture of what it looks like to be a heroin addict and how our assumptions and judgments of addicts are influenced by, you guessed it, the patriarchy and not humanity. In this episode, we're talking about how we're constantly learning from our mistakes as children and as adults, and that the connection between addiction and emotional regulation, and what are the best things that we can do to help future generations find a deeper sense of self-efficacy to avoid poor coping mechanisms, right? To avoid addiction and other ways of self-medicating to ease the pain that is the human experience, and how we're all human. She also really, I love towards the end of the episode, we talk a little bit about tough love versus boundaries and how we all need boundaries with everyone, but that doesn't have to mean excommunication. And I feel like, we are in the holiday season, friend. So boundaries come up a lot. They're pushed, they're pulled, they are shifted, and right, like we're constantly navigating this, and this reminder of self-regulation, self-medication, how we are regulating our systems, how we are handling stress, how we are coping, how we are holding our boundaries versus something else, right? And how can we do that in a way where we are being not just human, but also humane about it? And Erin is absolutely incredible. She's an author and an advocate. She's known for her writing on addiction, recovery, mental health, parenting, and relationships. At just 13, she was 13 years old when she began a 15-year struggle with heroin addiction. And with 19 years of recovery, she really has established herself as a respected voice in the national conversation around the overdose epidemic. Her memoir, Strung Out, is absolutely incredible. The link is available in the show notes. It is such a beautiful and empowering and real and human story that I cannot recommend enough. She also has a phenomenal advice column on Substack called Ask Erin, which also is in the show notes. And give her a follow on Instagram at Erin Khar. She writes for so many outlets. She is someone whose energy you want to be around, that you want to learn from. People, she's had this advice column for years, and she says it's because she's made the mistake so you don't have to. And it's her her openness, I don't want to say authenticity because we say it so much, what does it mean anymore? But like, she really is so truly herself and open that you feel so safe to be yourself around her. And I just can't wait to hear what you think of this episode. I know that for me, it really has shed a whole new light, created a whole new perspective, a whole new tone on how I look at my relationship with alcohol. And when in my life, the times when I have misused it, abused it, self-medicated with it versus when I haven't. And I'm really, really excited because this is something that we don't talk about a lot. And we have this picture of what addiction looks like, and it doesn't always look that way. So I invite you to listen to this episode with an open mind and an open heart, and I can't wait to hear what you think about it. You know, Erin, I feel very lucky to have met you on a personal level first, and then, you know, getting to know you and hearing your story and reading your incredible memoir, Strung Out. I want to learn everything from you.
I mean, you know, it's like, that's the tagline of my advice column. It's like, I've made so many mistakes. Like, that's honestly the way that I think that I've learned things, is just by making just a ton of mistakes.
Wait, this is really incredible that you're saying this, because it's really true. And this is something that I talk to people about a lot, especially people that I work with one-on-one or in small groups, because as adults, we forget how learning works. There's a lot of things, like we still have a lot to learn, but like I don't have as much to learn as like a 1-year-old. Like, they don't know how to use a fork. They don't know how to, you know, form a sentence, right? But if you look at a little kid, they are screwing up all the time. Learning to walk, they're falling down, sometimes getting hurt, sometimes not. And yet they get up and keep practicing. It is part of the learning process.
Right.
And then as adults, it's like, oh, that's something new. I should be able to do it immediately. And if I can't, there's something wrong with me. I'm terrible. I can't adapt. It's because this is screwed up and you're an asshole for asking me to do, you know, it becomes like a whole big thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We're afraid to fail.
We're so afraid to fail.
Yeah.
And based on what you said, which is a true thing, it is a requirement in order to learn.
Absolutely.
Now, this idea of failure, I had a podcast episode on my old podcast, Myth of Motherhood, with a good friend of mine and longtime client who has done 1 million rounds of IVF. And we titled the episode Failing Motherhood. We had this conversation about how if you experience infertility, if you have a C-section, if you use formula, like Everett came out of my vagina and my butthole, like there was medication involved. So like we're failures, right? Because we didn't meet this just sort of imposed ideal of what things are supposed to be. And obviously we were poking fun at that because that's a load of shit. I'd love to like hear like what have been your favorite failures?
I mean, my favorite failure, certainly, you know, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint one, but I feel like
That's
the most valuable, like in recent years, have been the times, honestly, when I know that I made a mistake with parenting and was able to have an honest conversation with my kid and apologize. And I say that because it's really, really hard as a parent to give up that control and admit that we were wrong. But it's also sort of the one of the greatest gifts we can give our kids, because we're teaching them how to take ownership of their actions or words, and that doesn't mean that you're not still loved or that there isn't still a relationship there. And I just think that like, and part of it probably certainly when I was growing up, that like, that wasn't a super common thing. There was an idea that like parents knew best and like, that was it. Yeah. And I don't always know best, right? I only can do my best, and I know that I'm going to make mistakes, and I know that sometimes I'm going to say the wrong thing or make the wrong decision or snap at my kid or whatever it is. The sort of gift there is that you're validating what they're feeling and then also modeling behavior that's going to serve them really well as they grow up.
That's what I was thinking. That's how we actually give our kids, or even when you do this in a relationship with like a peer or a colleague, but that's how we give each other permission to really be human, and that doesn't discredit you. It doesn't mean you never have any idea what you're doing. It means that we make mistakes, and that doesn't, it's a mistake.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be more or less than what it is.
That's such a big thing, especially as parents, to model for our kids, is that like, we're not defined by our failures or our mistakes. We're defined by how we handle them. And I think that that's what's character building, is sort of, because life, as we know, is never going to be just like this smooth sailing, no bumps in the road, nothing unexpected, no tripping experiences, right? We're going to make a lot of mistakes. Sometimes things that are going to happen that feel really unfair, and they are unfair, and there's no explanation for them, and we still have to deal with them. But I think that when we're able to sort of admit that to our kids, like that we don't have the answers, or that we're still figuring it out, or whatever, the case may be, that's just, it increases the trust that your kid has in you as well. And I'll give the caveat that there's a difference between like, a parent who just like falls apart in front of their kid and like, it's like, I don't know what I'm doing, and freaks out all the time, versus just having that sort of transparency of like, I don't know how we're going to fix this, but I'm going to keep trying, and I'm not going to let you drown, Yeah.
No, and I'm the adult here, and we are safe, and I'm on it. I don't have the answer right now. I will get it to you.
Right.
What I think is best right now is this.
Right.
And until we have something better, we will do this.
Yeah.
And I obviously, like, transparency is my favorite. Like, the truth, that's part of why, like, I don't really have a filter. I do end up in awkward situations because I name something that I'm not supposed to name.
Right.
I'm supposed to pretend it's not happening or not there. And I'm like, okay, I'll pretend after you all just, like, wink at me real quick. This is happening, right? Okay, cool. I don't have to, like, make it worse, but we all know. What was it like when... Not what was it like when you published your book about your drug addiction and getting pregnant, and how that changed everything, and just drug use in general. When you published your book, had you already spoken to your son about that? Was that already part of the dialogue? What was that like? And how did you, which fits into like some imperfect action that does not define everything. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is something that you can take ownership of and talk about. Right. What was that like? With your
that's
son?
Really kind of how I framed the book, right? The very first sentence of the book is, "Mom, did you ever do drugs?" And I looked at the book as sort of like how we answer that question for our kids. Like, how do you explain addiction to a child? Well, explaining it to him really started with talking about the things that I struggled with as a kid, which were, this desire to self-harm, suicidal ideation. I had had trauma. I had very little skills with emotional regulation. I didn't tell people what I was experiencing because I had so much shame around it. And my sort of coping mechanism was turning to drugs. And as a result, then all these other things happened. So when I first spoke to him about it, it was really talking about what was going on with me and why I turned to drugs at a really young age, and sort of like how ultimately that didn't really work out. The funny thing is that, like I've said many times, that like in many ways, like, I started using drugs very early. First time I stole a pill, I was 8. And the first time I shot heroin, I was 13. I was young. And in many ways, like, it kept me from killing myself, which seems counterintuitive, but I just could not handle what I was carrying around.
You self-medicated.
Yeah.
You needed
100%.
help, and you didn't have the tools to ask for and get it.
No.
And so, I mean, you took care of it yourself.
Yeah.
Which is also
it was
like,
survival,
Right, no, I mean, it was, we now know there are better options,
yes.
right? More sustainable, healthier options. Yet at the same time, for an 8-year-old to be like, I need a solution, like, you went and found it.
Right.
Which is, I mean, that takes a level of, resilience and self-sufficiency and self-awareness to know that something needed to happen, and is a product of not having the tools. And I mean, that happens with children are learning, but I'm sure you also, like, I know a lot of adults who don't have the tools.
So many adults don't have those tools. And, our parents' generation did not open up these discussions around mental health. I had, there was a lot going on just at home. My parents separated, lots of different things going on where I didn't feel like I didn't trust that they could handle the information. I didn't trust that it wouldn't destroy my mother, or that somehow, even though on some level I knew that, like, I had been sexually abused at age 4, like I knew it wasn't my fault, but I felt responsible. And it was like, I don't know, I just sort of intuitively had this notion of what that would do to my parents, which, I mean, now I look at it and it, like, breaks my heart that, like, even at such a young age, I was, like, worried about their feelings. I was going to protect them from this information, but that's why, I do a lot of speaking to parenting groups and sometimes to kids and, law enforcement and medical professionals about adolescence and drugs. And one of the things I always say is that the drug talk starts really early, as soon as you start talking to your kids, and it starts with talking about emotional regulation. And I think that's like sort of the baseline, because it's so symptomatic of other issues. There's no well-adjusted 13-year-old who's like, I'm going to take a needle and put this heroin in my arm. That's just not
right. Just, there's something behind that. That's just not happening. That's not just happening randomly. It's interesting that you say this, because, through my own personal lens, not having a history of addiction, that's not like the first thing that pops into my mind is having those conversations super early. Although, again, I love transparency. I talk about everything. Whenever, this was still when he was, like, in the bath, like in the thing, like in the support thing. Like, he wasn't sitting up in the bathtub by himself yet. I was washing his body, and I was naming his body parts, and I named, like, this is your penis. These are your testicles. We're going to call them balls because, they are testicles and we use anatomical terms. But I also know if you go into school and you're like, my testicles are itchy, kids are going to laugh at you. Right. Everyone says balls. Right. And I'm saying this to him and I'm like, I'm going to wash you. But like, Dad and I are allowed to wash you when we go to the doctor and they look in your diaper. But this is your body. And I started it. He was a tiny baby. And Jeremy was like, what are you doing, Alyssa? And I said, I'm practicing.
Yeah.
I'm practicing what I say, and I'm making this something that is spoken about.
Right. So body boundaries should be, right?
There will never be a time in our household where this isn't spoken about. So I was practicing. And so we could probably do well with, again, honoring where our kids are developmentally.
Yeah.
But bringing these things up. So when do you when do we start and it comes with emotional regulation, just sort of bringing that into the conversation around big feelings?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it starts when you see, those first tantrums, right? That's a lack of emotional regulation. And we see that play out in adults in road rage incidents and really scary things, right? That's a lack of emotional regulation. So definitely teaching with with both of my kids. I have one who's 19, one who's 5. So they're obviously very different stages, but from a really early age, teaching them things that I didn't know when I was younger, which could be as simple as breathing techniques, which is simple as mindfulness, right? Which is just noticing your environment and starting to get them to name objects in the room and do you see that tree outside the window? And then after a few minutes, they start to calm down. You say, oh, do you feel a little bit better? And then, because there's no point in trying to talk to somebody when they're in a heightened state, right?
No.
So those are sort of those the early stage setting for emotional regulation. And then it's obviously modeling it, which nobody does perfectly. I certainly don't. I still have moments where I'm I'm going to lose it. And I go give myself a timeout.
That's you practicing emotional regulation. The solution, the answer, the goal isn't to not feel feelings.
Right, of course.
And not feel the full range. It's, can you do that in a way where everyone involved knows they're safe? Even if I'm screaming into a pillow or throwing tissues, that it's oh, that's what mom does.
Right.
And get her energy out in a way. And she's doing that and she's going to come back great.
And I've told him before, I need a timeout. I'm going to go to my room. I need a timeout because I'm upset. And, he's seen, with my kids have seen me cry before and I'll explain to them why I'm sad.
Yeah.
If whether it's a friend of mine died and I'm really sad, my heart feels broken. And I need that minute to feel it. And then it's okay. It's okay. The world is not going to end if you feel grief or if you feel sadness or embarrassment or anger. Those are all normal feelings. And you're exactly right that the sort of, I definitely was raised in a way where there was an emphasis on sort of stifling them, because the second that anyone showed any emotion, you were crazy.
That is something that is not tolerated in my family.
Right.
You have to stop crying.
Right.
So then it leads to not even starting.
Right.
And then those feelings have to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense. And when you can't let them out or talk to talk to someone you trust about those feelings and you're left to them on your own and you're a young child and they're really big, you're going to choose something that separates you from them. That
100%.
gives you a little space or maybe a whole lot of space from them, because then you get a break. Because also, as I'm sure everyone knows, because we've all felt this at some point, being sad, being angry, grief, shame, all of those really big feelings, they are exhausting.
So exhausting. Exhausting.
You need a break.
Yeah. And I think that, like, for kids, particularly like when they enter adolescence, and adolescence, like what happens like physiologically inside the brain, like lasts well into your 20s. You know, it's not over when you turn 18. You know, they say for a lot of people as late as like mid to late 20s. So, you know, that's interesting because part of what happens, you know, with that prefrontal cortex is there's this place that I see people get stuck in where they, even if they know on like sort of a logical basis, they feel like they are going to be stuck in this terrible feeling for the rest of their lives. And that is where you see like a high incidence of like self-harm or kids, you know, using suicide as a means to escape that oppressive feeling.
It feels like a life sentence.
Right.
And the thing that just exploded in my brain as you were talking is that, you know, I've written a bit about the parallels between adolescence and matrescence, because physiologically in our brain, something similar happens, right? Our brain rewires in this way that, and our bodies change and our hormones change. There's a lot of similar things going on. And I also then immediately thought of, I certainly, the first few weeks postpartum, really was scared that this was never going to change. Those feelings of what did I do? I mean, I also had stitches in my butt. So there was a whole like, am I ever going to be able to, I came out of the bathroom once crying to Jeremy, like, am I ever going to not be afraid to go to the bathroom? Yeah. Because you're stuck in this, you're in this place where it does. You know it's going to change. Everyone told you it's going to change, but nothing about what you're feeling supports that.
And you feel like you can't bear it for one more second, you know?
No, and people would be better off if I was not involved. Like, that thought process. And I'm just trying to, you know, because I think sometimes it can be hard to, I mean, I think back on adolescence and it's almost like, wow, I was just feeling so much. I don't even know how to, almost can't relate to it because it's just like a whole, like, swirling tornado of things.
Oh, yeah.
But we do have these other times in our lives where we feel something kind of similar, where we can remember that. And something that you do often and beautifully is, you know, so often in those situations, especially with, like, I imagine with an older kid versus like a little kid, is that there is so much shame and stigma around mental health. Right. That these kids don't say anything. So it comes out of nowhere, using the air quotes, but it really, it came out of somewhere, but people weren't in tune with it. And so how do you, like, what do you recommend to help promote speaking up, like, courageously, in spite of any feelings of shame or stigma, knowing that that's there and being like, okay, that's there, and I am going to speak up for myself, for my friend, for someone I love?
Well, the first thing I always, and this goes back to, like, you know, when I talk to people about talking to kids about drugs and emotional regulation, is that I share and have shared with my kids about the things I struggled with at the ages that they're at. So when we open up conversations where we're not asking them to tell us anything, but we're just sharing, saying like, oh gosh, I remember in kindergarten, I was, you know, I had anxiety about like, oh, was I going to be able to hold my pee until, you know, recess? And I was afraid to raise my hand, but then I did, and it was okay. And, I remember that feeling and it's not, you're telling them stories, right? You're telling them stories from your past without asking them to do the same, without asking them to share what they might be struggling with. And I found that it creates, again, like a sense of trust and a sense that you've opened up to them without demanding anything of them, which really encourages them to do the same. And I have a really open relationship, particularly with the 19-year-old. He's older, we talk about some things and like, I'll tell people and they're like, I can't believe he talks to you about this stuff. And I said, well, it's because from the time he was a baby, his whole time growing up, I always had really honest conversations with him about what I struggled with. And I think that it has made him feel safe. And in turn, he's had friends come to me with things, or if a friend had a problem that he didn't know how to handle, he would either bring them to me and I would talk to the friend, or he would ask me what to tell them or how to handle something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important. And I say this, but I was not a perfect parent in any stretch of the imagination, especially with my older son, because I was so newly off of drugs. I stopped using drugs while I was pregnant. So I had spent, from age 8 to 28, like running away from feeling things and handling things, and was suddenly like, oh God, I have to be an adult and I have to figure out how to do all this basic stuff to take care of myself and take care of this little person. It was really,
and regulate a lifetime of feelings that that have not been handled.
Yeah. And it was really challenging.
Yeah. That's huge.
And I was very fortunate in that I had access to mental health care. I had health insurance. I had a family who, they may be dysfunctional, but they were supportive both emotionally and financially to help me access the care that I needed. And I always say this when I talk about it, because there's so many people who have children and then still use drugs or still really struggle with whatever they're struggling with in destructive ways. And that's not because I loved my kid more. It's because I had access that they don't have.
100%. And that again is, there is so much stigma around addiction, drug addiction for sure, alcohol addiction, any type of addiction. There's so much stigma, and misunderstanding and just judgment that, we see where it comes from, but it's so inaccurate, and it's just not, it's just not accurate. Like,
no. Yeah. Like we look at 2021 was like 121,000 deaths. I could be pulling this number incorrectly. It was well over 100,000 deaths by overdose in this country, right? The number one killer for adults between the ages of 18 and 49. Number one thing that kills people, surpassed cancer. So,
which is also the correlation between that and mental health.
Yeah. And the thing is that we have the addiction and overdose crisis is a product of systems that have failed people. It is not just a family in the home issue. It is, as a society, we have systems that have continually failed people. And certainly that's more true for people who are marginalized by poverty or by race, exponentially harder. We came from a place, like, in the whole time I was growing up, like the war on drugs and Just Say No and the DARE program. And it's all such bullshit because, I'm sorry, can I swear?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. It's done more to fuel the overdose crisis than anything else. The reason that fentanyl has taken such a strong hold in the drug supply is because of the flipping war on drugs. You know, I could go on a whole tangent about it, but you know, and there are still so many people who really look at addiction as a moral issue.
Yes.
And I say this incessantly anytime I speak about it, that, you know, addiction is not a moral issue. It is a public health issue, and people struggling with addiction are just human beings struggling with a human condition. It's that simple. And when we frame it that way, you know, I think that it's very easy for us to dismiss people who we think did it to themselves and have become this caricaturized like zombie, you know, from drugs.
Yeah.
And so much of the reporting around the opioid crisis has really done a lot to, you know, increase that sort of problematic view on it. You know, did pharmaceutical companies have a hand in increasing addiction among some people? Sure. What they did was shitty, and I'm not going to deny that. But the percentage of people who became addicted to opiates because they got a prescription, you know, for an injury is very small. The majority of people who went to pill mills and went down that whole road are people who first were introduced to the pills because somebody else had a prescription. They were misused. It wasn't, you know, and the substances themselves are neutral substances. Even fentanyl is a neutral substance. It does not have a conscience. It does not have an agenda, right? It's neutral. Right. And it was, you know, they're created for a reason. Painkillers kill pain. And because we don't have systems of support in place across the board, which certainly includes education, includes social support programs, mental health care, we have a large group of people who end up turning to them to painkillers for emotional pain, because they're very effective at deadening emotional pain in the same way that they do physical pain.
And when that is the resource you can get, that will be the resource that you use.
100%. And now, as like the backlash of sort of the opioid epidemic, people who are in pain cannot get pain medication. And this is a real issue. I 100% believe that anyone who has pain should be given pain medication. It is none of my business how bad their pain is, if they could just use ibuprofen or Tylenol. But taking a substance that is safe supply, pharmaceutical, we know how much is in it, is much safer than them turning to the street to buy something that's completely unregulated and unsafe.
Yep. So so much of this, I mean, everything you're saying is so true and so honest and makes so much sense. It's so human, you know, because this is a human being having a human experience. Right. And if you have someone in your life who's struggling with this, would you, how do we best support each other? How do we best create an environment where it's safe for us to talk to our kids, to destigmatize and do that, but also create a space where it is safe for someone who is struggling to be seen and be supported? Because I feel like there's a really big divide between that too, you know, enabling versus tough love versus, but when this is someone that you love that's struggling, or maybe you think they're struggling, I don't know. How do you present that to approach it?
The number one thing that I say is that, like, tough love is complete bullshit. I think that, you know, yes, are there people who are like, well, it wasn't until I got arrested and went to jail, my family cut me off, that, like, I got it. great. That person is an anomaly. The vast majority of people who are forced into rehab, forced into some sort of treatment, court-ordered, imprisoned, or cut off from their family and communities, that only serves to push them further into addiction for the majority of them, right?
Well, I mean, again, when we're thinking about this as a emotional, mental health thing, more isolation, punishment, shame, all of that is only heightening an already bad situation.
100%. And, you know, the thing that people confuse is that there's a difference between boundaries and tough love. You should have boundaries with everybody. Right? That doesn't mean that you excommunicate them from their life because they're struggling. You wouldn't excommunicate somebody from your life because they have cancer that keeps coming back. You wouldn't. You wouldn't excommunicate somebody from your life for having any other chronic illness. So for somebody who's struggling, and I understand that the behavior around people who are struggling with addiction can often have negative effects on their friends and family. That's why you have boundaries.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to have bigger, stronger, more boundaries.
Sure. Right? You don't cut them out of your life. You know, you still treat them like a human being. You still check in on them. You still let them know that you love them and that you're there. Take them for a meal. Check in on them. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as that. Even if they don't pick up the phone, just the gesture of telling somebody you love them and you're thinking about them can go a long way.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and listening to the end of this episode. Look at you. You're someone who finishes what they start. I love that about you. And if you're picking up what I'm laying down, be sure to visit me over at alissaalter.com for more resources on how you can alter your life, like downloading the 5-minute meditation that I use to start my day with confidence and ease, all before getting out of bed. See you next week.